I'm Jackie Calderwood, and I'm currently a research fellow at the Disruptive Media Learning Lab at Coventry University, working on a variety of projects at the moment. I joined the lab just over a year ago to work specifically on a big European Horizon 2020 funded project called Beaconing, which was about gamification and pervasive media, so location-based versions and desktop versions of a platform that teachers could easily author. So I finished my PhD, the date on it for handing it in was September 2017. I think it was the 8th of September 2017. And then I had my Viva in January 18 and passed with minor amendments, which I handed in within 3 months of receiving the report. And so that was all finalised. My certificate's dated September 2018, and I graduated at De Montfort in January this year, 2019. Yeah, so I started my PhD in October 2009, 10 years ago from now, almost 10 years ago, on a full-time basis with a bursary, which was fantastic, expecting to write up and submit within 3 years. So actually this is quite a key point that I didn't know until it came to the deadline of those 3 years, by which time I was in quite a bad state because I've been struggling trying to write up for the last 10 months of that period, that actually there was then a 6-month writing up time, and that it was not a failure to go into that 6-month writing up time, which I did. Meanwhile, I didn't actually finish writing up during that 6 months, so then I went into an extension to the end of the 4th year again, and at each of these thresholds I kind of didn't realise that there was a possibility to take longer. Obviously that's the ideal, and it would be lovely to finish within that time, and for different funding sources there's different degrees of seriousness as to what happens if you go over, or whether you can go over. But in my case it was possible to have extensions, and I did have a couple of extensions because of other things going on in life that needed attention, as well as my own kind of challenge in writing it up. But I think being aware of that is really helpful, because I wasn't aware, and so each time I really felt like I'd failed by not completing in the time, only to then discover that actually I was not the only person in the world that hadn't completed within that fixed time period. And then I unfortunately had to take out about 3 years interruption in total for quite serious external reasons, and each time trying to come back to get back into the writing up takes a period of months, because you just have to get really immersed in your work again if you've had a break and you come back to it. So with the final run there was more chaotic things going on, including my study catching fire and all of my books for my PhD going up in smoke. Fortunately not my laptop. So I continued, and that time I actually got there and submitted. So that was September 2017. So for me actually it was is that 8 years, I think. But just to say that one's own expectations, I think, are the key thing. That sometimes it's easy to feel like it's the outside world judging, saying you can't do this, or you can do that, or you must do it this way. But I found that my expectations were a really strong part of how I dealt with that as well. So just to be gentle with yourself, but equally to keep going. I tried to get it down to 4 words at one point, and that was landscape, people, technology and media. So I suppose I would say those are definitely 4 of the key ingredients. A really key ingredient, of course, was me. I was driving the research and setting up the projects that I would be researching through. So Yeah, absolutely. As a practice-based researcher, right at the heart of that research, as well as the questions surrounding that. How can pervasive media contribute to a multimodal, holistic user experience of the ambulance landscape? Around that question, I'm looking at particularly rural landscapes, how non-traditional audience engage with pervasive media. So that's media that's with the user out in their environment. It might be on a mobile device, it might be triggered by location or triggered by some other sensor. And then I'm also looking, drawing on my background in community arts, at how can that user also contribute creatively to the content that they experience. So that then took the research question on further to say, how can they create content in a moment, in a specific location, through the use of pervasive media technology that is some expression of their experience of being in that time and place. So I think for me, I came to do a PhD a year after I'd finished my master's, and my MA at UE in Bristol was about interactive media, and that's where I first started to work with pervasive media and a particular platform at the time. So I'd spent 2 years, or a year and a half of the MA, and then a year subsequent to that as a resident at Bristol's Pervasive Media Studio, really beginning to engage with the issues of this new emerging field. And I'd been part of the ethics research group there, for example, at the studio, come across really interesting philosophy that was relevant to pervasive media. So I think my interest actually in the area, in the topic of my doctoral research, really right from the beginning was a mixture of theory and practice. My background, as I said, was as a practitioner, as a community media artist, and so to an extent that work had always been a kind of research, in that there would be a set of issues, problems, questions, and a context, and a set of desired outcomes that I would be working to, and my role would be to figure out how to go about doing that and fulfilling those outcomes, and looking at what unexpected learnings come up along the way. So in that sense, the practice was always a kind of a research, but the theory was something that came in much more during that latter part of my master's, in that period at the Pervasive Media Studio. And in preparation for the PhD, obviously writing a proposal is months before starting, and all of that process, preparing to write the proposal, needs looking at a body of theory and deciding where one's interests lie and where to position the research. So I think, yeah, I would say theory and practice were, I was going to say hand in hand, but I think actually it was a bit more kind of like bat and ball, if you like. So there would be, I did a lot of going to conferences and symposiums, and my research is transdisciplinary and can fit with quite a lot of different fields, because it was an emerging area of research. I wanted to kind of check out what different fields were saying about this area as well. So I did a lot of going to literally different physical places to find out what people were doing, but also different sort of theoretical places, if you like, to find out what was going to be the best fit, and what was going to inform the way that I wrote up my PhD, but also how that, through more of a kind of osmosis process, would actually inform the practice that was developing. So my methodology is very much one of reflective practice anyway, so that's totally an integral part of the way that I work. I also work very iteratively. The medium necessitates that, but that's also my own working process. So, for example, as part of my portfolio of creative practice, I had 4 major public art projects, and within those there were smaller parts. One of them, the experimental walks, has lots of different experimental walks projects within it, so sort of nested projects. So there's a constant cycle then of reflection and also dissemination. So I'm very much using dissemination as part of my working practice as well, hence another aspect of going to different conferences and symposiums and publishing and showing work is all part of that kind of reflective process and the development of the work itself. So again, it's a kind of constant exchange with the world around. Yeah, kind of a constant dialogue like this. I was really fortunate that I think, you know, all of the conferences that I attended were generous environments where people were happy to consider and take on someone else's perspective. I know, there's a sort of bogey monster, if you like, of academic conferences being somewhere where you get completely shot down and the rug pulled out from under your feet and your work criticised and torn apart, as if that's a healthy way forwards. And perhaps I like to think that in the arts we're a little bit more evolved than that. I don't know. I didn't only go to arts conferences. I went to lots of different sectors. Perhaps it's a myth. Perhaps it's a history. I don't know. Perhaps I was very lucky not to have to engage with that. But yeah, so I found people very generous, really interested in the work. And one of the loveliest things for me, I think, is well, an example would be the conference that I was funded by the IOCT to go to as part of my bursary for my research, was the International Visual Sociology Association, IVSA, who had their conference 3 years into my research in Vancouver. And the theme was around participation and collaboration. And so I went and presented there. And so people from a very different field, curiously working in the field of visual sociology, and yet most of the presentations were not visual in the sense of images or diagrams. It was a lot of text. It was very text-based. So I presented a lot of images from my practice, and yeah, and had really inspiring feedback, and I had that in other contexts as well. For example, an engineer being really interested in my educational project with young people with media on the top of a hilltop in Somerset, and somehow taking away from that research to inform and inspire the way he's thinking about his research in a completely different field. So I think that's really exciting, and obviously I've experienced that the other way around as well, being inspired by those engineers and those sociologists and so on. I think it's so healthy to bring people from different fields together, and I think it's really, really healthy to share work that's in process. I think, you know, there can be an expectation that something has to be very finished and polished before it's shown, but actually at that point it's like you've solidified it, and it's maybe a little bit harder to go back in and change it, or maybe not appropriate at all. But when it's in process, it's still really malleable. And so, you know, I couldn't really define easily or readily the way that all of those different experiences and engagements with people and places and ideas have influenced my work. That's part of the challenge of the thesis, to articulate that. But when you get down to the sort of nuances of so many experiences, you know, how do we put that into context? How can we put that into words? And perhaps it's not until sometime later, maybe years later, when something that was said or seen years before kind of lights up, and, you know, okay, I can use that here, or now I understand where that influence came from, or what I was actually doing at the time. There's so many ways that we can read our work. I suppose there's also a real interest in my work in iterating the work itself over platforms and times and places and communities. So that's a part of my working process. It's very much part of the work in my creative portfolio, and in the model that I talk about in my thesis. So in that sense, it's never finished, because there's another iteration where it moves to a new platform, place, community, context, but it doesn't leave behind what happened elsewhere. So in literal terms, that will be participant feedback from one showing will become part of the work when it's reshown the next time, as an example. So then that malleability continues, you know, and I think that's absolutely lovely, because it does leave room to be surprised and for new things to emerge. And, you know, surely that's what it's about, for, you know, emergent knowledge, where we can kind of go, wow, I didn't expect that, or, you know, I did expect that, and here it is. I had a situation when I was writing a paper for a conference, it was so lovely, where I was trying to find a creative way of capturing the experience of the particular project I was writing about, which is called Hunter Gatherer, and is a geocaching project with crowdsourced digital media as the treasure for finding geocaches. And through this, a magical creature comes alive that's the magical creature of all of the participants' contributions and of the place itself and the project. So I was trying to write a paper that somehow would get the essence of, you know, traipsing through the landscape of the Yorkshire Dales looking for this plastic box that's hidden somewhere, and getting stung by stinging nettles in the process, and then, you know, opening the box and there was a sound button in there that's allegedly the voice of the magical creature. So I wrote in the paper about this experience, and these two geocache characters that I invented, sort of saying, oh, we're a cache that speaks, and then a couple of other things. And just a few weeks later, on the geocaching website, one of the comments that came back from a real geocacher, unbeknown to me, was, wow, we found this cache that speaks. So it's lovely, you know, even across time, there's, and certainly across platform and ways of communicating, there's these kind of feedback loops that come into play. It's quite curious. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? I certainly think that's that the thesis itself is now out there in the world, and that was one of the things that really, you know, kind of motivated and inspired me to keep going through the laborious time of trying to write it up. That it really needed to be out there in the world. It needed to be its own thing, and I guess that's the beauty of PhD, that actually you do end up with this thing that is there out in the world and stands alone, and, you know, it does become a reference material. I remember people saying that to me previously when I was still working on it, you know, still a student, that it will become like a textbook that you can go back to, and I am finding that now. You know, I go back to get particular things because I think, actually, no, I'd really thought about that, I'd really grappled with it and written it a particular way, and the references and everything there. So what did I say about, you know, X in my thesis? And it is a useful resource. So it's, yeah, it's out there. It's a thing of its own. I suppose this interview now is really exciting to me, with the idea that actually it will be part of this new website that you're building, and people will find it and, you know, look at it, make their own views about whatever they engage with it. So that, in a sense, is then it sort of having a life of its own and being out in the world. So yeah, I think that's really exciting, because I remember at one point one of my supervisors sort of trying to encourage me not to fret so much about the writing and just get on with it. I think it's probably the underlying text, but saying, you know, only 2 people are going to read this. What's the big deal? And I was like, no, loads of people are going to want to read it. And then you kind of hand it in and have your viva and think, okay, maybe only 2 people are ever going to read this, or maybe 3, you know. A couple of examiners, a supervisor, to feel that it can have more impact is lovely. A written thesis, aiming for 40,000 words, a little over. And then my practice, so 4 major public art projects as a portfolio of creative practice, which are all evidenced online. So part of my working process had been to have project development blogs and a thesis blog as well, PhD research blog. So those constitute part of that evidence. But also I personally felt it was really important, it kind of aligns with my methodology and my theoretical approach to the research, to present a lot of material, a lot of the contributions from people at different iterations of each project. So I constructed a huge online, what I initially called appendices, and was rightly corrected by my examiners that actually I'd muddled together the portfolio and the appendices, and so to separate that back out, that so what I ended up with as my final submission is the 4 projects represented online with enormous amounts of evidence and documentation around that, and then also a set of appendices with additional material, for example, interviews I conducted and things around ethics and various other materials. So yeah, there's a lot of visual material in there. There's some video, some audio, there's some of the scripts of the created technologies, and there's a lot of reference and links to websites and blogs that are all part of that creation process. There's documentation of public events and so on, conference papers that were published. All of that's either sitting within the portfolio of practice if it's directly evidencing that particular project, or if it's more supporting material, then it's in the appendices, and those are, yeah, all online. So in the written thesis, there's quite a lot of reference to the creative portfolio online and to the supporting material in the appendices. But I also used a lot of images in my text. So I don't know how many offhand, but there's a lot of photographs from the different projects. There are hand-drawn illustrations, and there are hand-drawn flow charts for sort of project timelines, some tables of data, participant information, that kind of thing, screen grabs. Also, I used screen grabs of PowerPoint presentations quite a lot, again about this sort of iteration through time, place and platform. So it was capturing, it wasn't a deliberate decision to do it in order to show those iterations, but it felt like the right way to present the work. And then I thought about it and felt, yes, this is part of my process, as well as evidencing the original picture, if you like. So it's the representation of the representation. So yeah, quite a lot of images and drawings within the actual text, as well as references to the material in the portfolio. Okay, yeah, so I think on how to present, or how the artwork and the written text integrate and how those then get presented in the submission, that was definitely an enormous process to go through, of finding a way to do that. I think probably trying on what I thought should be expected, trying to make sense of what other people had done and see if I could use that, relate that to what I would be doing, and ultimately, yeah, have a huge kind of wrestle, internal and external wrestle of how do I put this thing together, and how do I present it in a way that's congruent, because it's practice. So it's a phenomenological thing that in my opinion, needs to carry through the text, hence talking about finding creative ways of writing other texts prior to the thesis. But also because of, I haven't talked about yet, but the methodology that I brought into my practice partway through my PhD is clean language and clean space and symbolic modelling. And that's all about the affordances of a system being all the way through that system, and the congruence and co-congruence within that system. So if I think of my PhD as a system, or I would now call it a symathesy, which is Nora Bateson's word for a kind of learning living organism. So this learning living organism, it's got to be true to itself. You can't have one part that operates in one way and another part that operates totally differently, unless that difference works and is part of the whole symathesy. So I think that's a huge issue for practice-based research. You know, how do we present our work in a way that is true to the work, true to the practice, and rigorous and theoretical, and, you know, honours all of the nuances and the personal involvement that's in there. That's why I said at the beginning, you know, one of the key ingredients, I would now say very clearly, is me. I don't know that I would have said that at the beginning. I don't think that was, I certainly didn't feel that I was in an environment where that was said, or where perhaps sometimes that was not even all right to be said. You know, whether that's my preconceptions or others' views, I don't know, but probably both. So where were we? Wrestling, tussling, wrestling. That's it. We were wrestling with how to bring the practice and the text together. Yeah, so with a big fight, and loads of false attempts, and loads of procrastination, and kind of absolute terror. How do I do this thing? How do I get this thing that's so precious, so me, so my inquiry? Therefore, I'm very involved in it, but also kind of respecting of it. It's this curious thing that I've decided to devote years of my life to pursuing. You know, how do I then put that in a solid form, and a finite form, albeit for this period of time, to send it out into the world, and how can I possibly do that justice? So I found that hugely difficult, challenging process. The methodology obviously was practice-based right from the start, no question about that. Also transdisciplinary right from the start, and yeah, through a phenomenological inquiry. A year into my research, I came across CLEAN and the methodology of David Grove, a clinical psychologist. His practice that's now used around the world in all sorts of different areas. And at that time, 2010, was still very new to research, not really being used in research at all. So I experienced CLEAN by inviting a colleague to come and do a knowledge sharing workshop for the Postgraduate Research Student Association at De Montfort. And when we were talking about what might be appropriate, and there would be, you know, a community of researchers from all different fields, also many people with English not as their first language, research in lots of different formats. And he said, oh, okay, there's this thing called CLEAN language that might be useful, because it can really help you if you're doing interviews, and also help you with your awareness of your own language. And when you're, you know, we would all be writing up, we'd have that in common. So this could be useful. So he did a fantastic session for us, and I was the demonstration client for a little, just a 10-minute demo. And during that demo, I really felt like this CLEAN language process is doing for the subject, myself in that case, just something very similar to what I aspire to do, to the space I aspire to create for participants in my artwork. I want to know more. So I found out a lot more, was invited to a conference, had a huge amount of support around rapid immersion in CLEAN language, and just took that on as the methodology that I wanted to integrate and interrogate through my practice as part of my research. I think the first year I'd been really looking around in these different fields and trying to find what kind of language, if you like, that I would use to talk about my research. I knew implicitly my practice. A big challenge for me as a doctoral researcher was to articulate what's unique about my approaches, mainly because one of the unique things about my approach is not articulating that and keeping myself out of the picture. It's about community engagement, not a kind of egocentric artistic practice. So that was really challenging, but I kind of felt very much felt this connection between the experience of clean and the experiences that I was aspiring to in the practice. So yeah, that became a really big part of the thesis, of the practice. My second, third and fourth projects, practical projects, all interrogated clean in different ways and used metaphor and symbolic modelling to create the project and to engage participants and to deliver the pervasive media experience to audiences as well. So it naturally had to become part of the way that the whole thing was written up and put together. And I spent years modelling, questioning, trying to figure out how to do that. Yeah, it's in there. It's one whole thing now. So I suppose it expanded it. It brought in a new layer of inquiry. It created a lot more work. Created enormously lot more work, which I created for myself, because I went off and trained in clean and actually trained to be a trainer of clean as well. So I devoted an enormous amount of time, energy and practice to becoming fluent in that and well versed in it and exploring it in lots of different dimensions of other areas that people were using it in as well, ways of using it, in order to really kind of get it in the muscle, and really know it that way. And yeah, I suppose with anything, if you inquire into it, it can take on a life of its own. It can be become a big thing. So yeah, it certainly added to my workload, and that was my choice for reasons that I think were really core to my research question and my approach. So in that sense, yeah, it did. Maybe I don't know that it sent it in a different direction, but it certainly added an enormous amount to it. I think that a PhD is an amazing opportunity of time to explore and to do what you want to do. That's why I naively went into doing a PhD thinking, great, 3 years to explore what I want to explore. I didn't really understand what was involved at that point. So everybody's coming from a different place and will want something different out of it. So I think it depends very much what journey you're on, whether you want to veer off or add extra layers in, or delve deep, or whatever metaphor we use. I took a long time ending up writing up my thesis for various reasons, but probably part of that might have been the extra complications that I gave myself by adding on another methodology, but equally it might be the extra complications that I gave myself deliberately by choice of doing 4 projects rather than 1 project. So should somebody take on new methodologies or dive into areas that interest them on their journey, I think definitely, if you don't do it now, when are you going to do it, and why not? Absolutely. And don't be afraid to then come back out and say, okay, well, I dipped my toe in there and then I found it didn't work. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Or maybe I thought it was absolutely fantastic, but it doesn't fit with my research question. So I'm coming back right now and I'll put that on a back burner. And once I've handed in my, once I've graduated and I've got my doctorate, then I'll go back to that area. Maybe you choose that, but don't walk past it by if you've got the opportunity. Yeah, so I was absolutely delighted to hand in. Best, absolutely the best. um, and yeah, then it was the horrible period of waiting to hear when the Viva would be, and hoping it might be that month or maybe the next month or the next month. And yeah, it took a long time to hear, and in the event, it was 4.5 months, which isn't an unusually long period, but it certainly seemed like it when I was waiting. Once I'd got a date, that was much easier, but the period in between was quite hard waiting. Um, and I forget what was happening at the time now, but I know that I was quite busy, and actually finding the time to really reread my thesis over and over, or pick it up and dive into it, was seemed to be quite hard to find. But that was what I wanted to do with that time, was having got past the pressure of the deadline of giving it in, to actually sit with it. And in fact, actually, that's the first thing that I did do after I'd given it in. I went abroad and I took it with me, and I just read it bit by bit over the next week or so. to kind of enjoy it and see what I'd actually written from a new perspective. So that felt really important, that actually the process of staying with it. And I've heard people say that they've given in their thesis and then they don't want to look at it again, or they've had their Viva and then they never want to get back to their thesis. I think that's such a shame, because you've put so much work into it. I certainly found a lot of mistakes when I was reading it through, but that was okay, because I was just highlighting them. And you know, chances are you're going to have some mistakes highlighted in your Viva that you're going to have to correct. So when I corrected those, I corrected the ones that I'd found as previously as well. And the Viva is your opportunity to defend your work, obviously. We could have conversations about whether that's the right metaphor to use or not, which I did have prior to it, but having had the Viva, actually I think it's exactly the right metaphor for what happens. Whether what happens is the right thing or not, that's another argument. I don't think it's the wrong thing. I think it was a great experience, and I was certainly defending my position, but not from an aggressive enemy, but from two people who were curious about that position, and obviously by definition seeing it from different perspectives, because no two people see the same thing from the same perspective, I would argue, coming from a clean background. And so, of course, there's going to be potential different readings and potential different insights and understanding. And so it really challenged me in the Viva to come sort of centre stage and to stand my ground and to say, that's a really interesting idea, but no, this is my idea. This is how I've voiced this. This is why I've done this. This is what I'm trying to say. Perhaps it didn't come across clearly, so let me explain it again. This is what I'm trying to say. And for me, with my background, that's very challenging, because a lot of my practice is totally about listening to other people's points of views and taking that on board, and in a sense trying to give other people's voice more precedence than my own in the work. So there came a point in the Viva when I realised, I caught myself almost falling into that. And thought, no, that's not what this is. Don't do that now, right now. Jackie, you've got to say what you think, not kind of go down the, oh yes, your idea is very interesting route. That's just not appropriate. I had a long period writing up my PhD with long interruptions, and then I had a long Viva. And when I came out, I felt like my brain had been stretched and sort of pummeled and been through a gym in a way it had never been before. And that's how I could describe it. One of the things I did before the Viva was we booked to go into the room the day before to see the room, and You could have a mock Viva, but I didn't really fancy that. I just wanted to go and be in the space and decide where I'd want to sit in the space and things like that. And actually that, for me personally, that was a really, really helpful thing to do. When it came to it, the examiners wanted me to move the next day when it was the Viva. So I didn't get to sit there, but I'd already kind of befriended the space that we were going to be in, so that was helpful. My Viva started late, so that was a little bit nerve-wracking that the examiners weren't there yet. There'd been some delay in them getting there. But also, actually, that turned around to feel really positive, because I was so relieved it wasn't me that was late. So when they did come, we started about a quarter of an hour late. And then I think the Viva was about 4 hours. And I think possibly part of the reason for that was a really thorough interrogation on the part of my examiners about what is this relationship between the theory and the practice, and where is the contribution to knowledge, and are we speaking the same language in the way that we're articulating that? Well, I think the Viva is an absolutely essential part of it. My thoughts actually coming out after the Viva was, now I get it. The thesis is an examination text, and I've written my own examination text, and they're examining me on it. I hadn't seen it like that before, but that's what it felt like at that moment. I was looking forward to my Viva because people had said sort of early on in my doctoral research that it's a great opportunity. You've actually got specialists in your field who've read every single word that you've written, and how often do you get that? And the whole thing is going to be a conversation about your work. So I was, I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and I'm really grateful that I'd had that seed planted in my mind beforehand, wherever that came from, to think of it that way, because I think that's helpful. And I also think that's very true, and in that sense it's a gift. I mean, yeah, okay, a scary, horrible one as well, but but it doesn't have to be horrible at all. It is a rare gift to have people with that level of expertise and knowledge really engaging with something that you've produced, and that is obviously going to be, close to your heart, key to your interests, and the result of your practice, or whatever, and to be able to have conversations around that. I suppose I perhaps thought there would be a bit more detailed questions about the practice itself in some respects, whereas there was, as I said, a lot of this sort of overarching how these things relate to one another. But yes, a good experience. One of the comments, actually, while we were talking about this relationship between the practice and the text, or the portfolio and the text, however you want to think of it, and I was saying, well, that work took place on top of a hilltop. I can't take you there. That's why it's as it is here in this room. And one of my examiners said, "Oh well, I would love you to take us there, take me there." And so I think I got the impression that she's familiar with either supporting or examining, or both, practice-based PhDs where actually the creative artifact is part of the examination. I know somebody else, a good friend of mine, whose research was by practice, although his thesis was a full written submission of over 80,000 words, because it was more practice-led research, I think, potentially fair description. But he took his examiners on a sound walk that was what he was writing about and what he was developing as his research. So, yeah, that wasn't even a practice 50-50 submission, and yet the experience of the practice was part of not the Viva per se, but the examiners had that experience after the Viva, I think. none of it was made to be experienced in a room in the university. So to have given them a live experience of it would have either meant setting up something to take them out to, or representing the work again as an exhibition. I have exhibited it in exhibition formats. So I think there's a question as to whether an exhibition should be part of a Viva for practice-based research. And I think if that had been there right from the beginning as an expectation, then obviously I would have addressed that and created versions of the work that would be experienced live as part of the Viva. I think that would be a really good suggestion. I think if I give advice to myself starting from now, I would say really have confidence in your practice, in what you're already doing, because that's where the essence of that new knowledge will come from. It will come through that. It might come from out in the world, things that you find as well, but it'll just as much and more consistently come from within the existing practice. Yeah. So I think I would, in practical terms, then say to myself at that stage, write up now, write about the way that you make work. Because I think when I started, I was really looking outside for ideas and theories and contexts within which to ask my research question. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do, but perhaps what I didn't do that would have also been very valuable would have been to articulate, to write about the working processes that I was already using. I mean, I did it as I made work. The blogs definitely do that. They capture it, but they capture it as a diary with reflection within that, rather than completely focused on what's this methodology I'm using. I didn't really understand that question. That was a big question mark. What is this methodology I'm using? And that was part of looking outside of, like, should I be using that methodology or that approach? Or, what existing body of thought do I situate myself within, situate my research within? I think that's a real challenge for practice-based research, because we're already doing it in a way, and that how we're doing it might change, as some of the questions that you asked, do those things make us change direction, or what shifts happen as a result? But essentially there's a lot that we're actually already doing. Maybe I'm a little bit unusual in that sense, that I was not going straight through education, but coming in as a mature student, even when I did my undergraduate degree, and then coming to my PhD with 15 years experience of running my own business as a practitioner, essentially. So bringing that in, obviously people have different routes, and for someone who's come straight through education, then it may be a different situation, a different relationship with practice. They're going to be starting in a different place. Perseverance, definitely. There's so many times that I could have stopped. So perseverance. One of the things that really appealed to me about being a doctoral researcher was to be part of this community of amazing-minded people doing really interesting things in the university, and the Institute of Creative Technologies at De Montfort was a really fantastically rich place for that, really exciting and inspiring. And then the networks out across the university through various different things like the transdisciplinary network and things, also tapping into really interesting research happening that I would never have imagined of before meeting some of those people, some of those subjects and so on. And then with the Postgraduate Research Student Association, similarly having social events and knowledge sharing events. I think those sort of things are so important as part of your experience, because as the time through the PhD progresses, there's much more of an introspection in bringing this thing to a focus, creating the thesis text and whatever evidence of practice you might be creating as well, but creating your artifact for submission. And so it's important to feel part of a community and part of a network, even if you only see people very occasionally, but to have built that up in the first year, 18 months, I think for me was very useful to counter the isolation that can be a part of the writing up process. Madness.